I can open the floor, normal procedure. Please introduce yourself, the organization you represent. We start with questions if you have targeting Michael's presentation, DG Sante, and then we open the floor. We have until 11:15, so we can have around 20-25 minutes of Q&A, depending. I will do a clustering approach, so I open the floor and we can start with the questions and answer session.
Bon, donc je suis Nadine Dominicus.
I'm Nadine Dominicus from ECFAN Belgium, and I've been a member of a Guinea-Bissau NGO for more than 10 years now. I have a different opinion from you from the African point of view, in particular populations who live far from the capital. Food safety is conceived of as assuring production so that they don't die of hunger or suffer from malnutrition. We should keep in mind that the traditional African society is very ecologically orientated, and they know about good food. I'm not talking about epidemics now, but they understand the importance of this for survival. So we cannot say don't eat this fruit rather than that fruit because it's not good. So we have to take into consideration the African knowledge of agricultural products. I'm not talking about the cities where they have actually lost touch with their traditional roots in that regard.
Hello, my name is Professor Linson. I'm an academic. Michael, it's not really a question addressed to you, but you are from the Commission, so I shall be making a short comment regarding the Commission and have other suggestions. I shall be very brief because I'm not the only person who would like to take the floor. I'd just like to give a warning to the ACP. I mean, don't expect too much from the European Commission because, to my mind, the European institutions as structured are not sustainable. There is a need for a fundamental institutional architectural revolution that is needed to prepare the transition. So that's a warning to the ACP. Very shortly, hygiene and food safety, education. You might be interested in customized interactive software. We are working on this. Food safety, again, biodegradable sensors. We are working on that too. And finally, yes, the leitmotif of this lecture or this interchange is capacity building. I would like to suggest, I mean, so capacity building in food safety, capacity building in governance. I would like to invite the panelists to join the new capacity building program. With already 140 countries participating. This blends together what we call the education of tomorrow, the governance of tomorrow, smart cities, life science and medicine. And we are busy working on preparing our Info Week, where we expect something like 260 delegations to prepare the first ever World Summit on World Society, Wellbeing, Quality of Life. And the deliverable of this summit shall precisely be a tool that is so needed by everybody to facilitate coordinated multi-stakeholder collaboration worldwide, because we are faced with a global network of interconnected global challenges that can only be appropriately managed by first setting up a new global governance infrastructure. I shall finish here by just saying that there are now two solutions circulating worldwide regarding achieving the citizens' welfare. One is the European Commission, EIT, and so-called United Nations Sustainable Development Goals solution that has been directly inspired from our work without the slightest recognition, or the new capacity building program that is becoming an increasingly recognized alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question?
Thank you very much, Michael. Just to indicate that indeed your presentation was on point with regard to the very serious way in which business and everyone take the matter of food safety in Europe. But also to highlight to you that in Africa at the present time we have the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, the CADAP, which is a heads of state program, well structured to ensure that agriculture is used as a tool for economic growth on the continent. And obviously, one of the key areas we have to look at in order to succeed in agriculture is the market. So what I can say is that in terms of yourself and your colleagues who work in Africa, it is important to use CADAP as an entry tool. When each country is doing its investment plan for agriculture, the National Agricultural Investment Plan, which is built around CADAP, it is important that food safety becomes an integral part of whatever partnership you have with that particular country. Thank you.
So, Michael, two issues. The domesticization dimension of CADEP, so the ownership of food systems, we mentioned it, and how Europe can look into this, and the architecture. Is the architecture fit for purpose today?
I work with the European Commission. You know, we're not exactly. Let's say we're subject to a lot of criticism, and it doesn't do any harm. Again, I stressed again and again the importance of citizens' demands. They have to be taken very, very seriously, and if they're not, well, you pay a price, and we do take them very seriously. But if I may, just very briefly, in relation to the experience in Guinea-Bissau, I fully accept food security is a rather subjective term, and for a lot of African citizens, it's having enough on the table today. And that I know and accept. And I think, Leo, you referred earlier that demands in this area are increasingly in relation to, let's say, societal expectations. It's not just, is it safe, but is it environmentally sustainable, is it ethical, is it animal welfare friendly, etc., etc. And European consumers, again, lead on all these issues. And I think a consideration in that context in relation to Africa is the impact of our consumption patterns and our demands on the ground in rural Africa. And it's good that there are NGOs like you trying to sensitize our consumers in this area, because they need to be. On the issue of, you know, has the Commission the capacity to respond? I wouldn't advise anybody to be reliant on the European Commission, or indeed any other institution, academic, political, or economic. You know, ultimately, we're all masters of our own destiny, and I speak of countries. So if country X legitimately has its own goals on development and sustainability, whatever, ultimately they have to look to themselves. Yes, they can look to the Commission to provide some level of assistance, as they can look to any other aid donor, but we don't pretend for one moment to have all the answers to all the problems of the world, nor should we. We're very aware of our limitations. But let's not forget, in the specific area of food, we're still the world's largest exporter, we're the world's largest importer, we're the world's largest aid donor, and our standards are very often the international benchmark. So if you trade in food or you're interested in food, it's very hard to avoid us. You might not like us. You might think we're not doing a particularly good job, but difficult to ignore us. And then finally, in the context of CADAP, again, we're very conscious of the limitations on our own resources. If we can work through intermediaries and get a better on-the-ground impact, of course, that's economies of scale. You know, there are a lot of African countries. We need to work with you, and again, I stress, you know, we don't have the solutions to all your problems. And if we can more efficiently and effectively through organizations like yours, well, by all means, we have to. It's not my own direct area of responsibility, but, you know, we're very much sold in Europe that our aid effort has to be done in cooperation with African countries. You know, we're all very conscious that aid has to be led by recipients. You know, we can't dictate to you how to do it or on what conditions. We have to work with you. So if I may, I'll conclude with that. My colleague, Jackie Lagosle, is here and can take any other questions while I rush back and make it to the airport.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. And Jackie, you can come maybe here if there are any other questions.
Thank you.
So, another round of questions. I see 1 and 2 close by and 1 at the back. So 3 other questions, yes.
Bonjour, Catherine.
Good morning.
Catherine
Ansminger from the Cocoa Association. I'm going to take advantage of the interpretation to speak in French. I'd like to have a point of clarification. I'd like to know about blockchain and food safety. I don't know if it was presented by Mr. Scannell or not, but I would like some more information about the Commission's ambitions in that regard. And I'd like to know something about the timeline and the implementation. I'd like to know whether this system will be created as a European system or whether it will be conceived as being a system carried out with other international organizations.
Thank you. My name is Witsokon Sabele, and I am with the South African Embassy in Brussels. Thank you all for your presentations, and very much appreciated. And a couple of points or reflection. Food safety is really an outcome, if you think about it. And so it assumes that across the value chain that all actors have played their role. But it appears that every time we look at it, we almost want to break it down and look at a certain portion of the chain, as opposed to really looking at the entire value chain and measuring the outcomes based on the precise actions across the value chain. For instance, you could produce a wholesome, safe pound of meat, but it's very easy for it to be contaminated on the kitchen table in the home, and then it gets rendered unsafe at that point. And in making that point, I'm just trying to elucidate that impacting on policy on its own does not necessarily result in improved safety, nor does improving farming practices on the farm will necessarily ensure safe food. And in making these comments, I really wanted to go back to the presenters and say, listen, if I'm here and I'm a politician, for lack of better words, what are your top 5 recommendations? At least 5 is doable, 10 might be confusing. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? So that I'll give a final round maybe to the speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm Asan Dambi from Wageningen University and Research. My question goes to Christina and also to Morak. And Christina, you rightly pointed out that there is an issue with enforcement of regulations when it comes to quality and safety in East Africa based on your experiences. And I also work in this sector, in the dairy sector in East Africa, and I have also experienced cases where there is one processor rejecting milk due to its quality and another processor nearby gladly taking the same milk and processing and selling in the same market where the other processor is selling. So both processors are competing in the same market, but you don't have the incentive to enforce policy safety standards because of lack of enforcement of regulation. And, well, I want to go back to Christina's point where she mentioned that, of course, there are a number of stakeholders who are policy makers. And based on all the interventions which I've heard today in the sector, they are focusing on the chain, but I haven't seen much done to the policy makers. So my question is, what are we doing to motivate these policy makers to consider safety and food quality more, and how can we support them also to be able to build their capacity to regulate in these countries?
Thank you very much. So I'll give the, if I don't see, I'm not seeing any other questions. Okay, yes, one, yeah.
Hello, my name is Gianluca Nura. I'm from NSF Hero Consultants. We are one contractor working for better training for safer food, and we are also a provider for the Fit for Market project. I have a question for Morag. So when you express a better capacity building with an holistic approach, I would like to know what you mean specifically, and how the contractors can improve these capacity building projects. That's my question. Thank you.
There is another question further down.
Avons un autre intervenant au fond.
Merci. Je suis conseiller à l'ambassade d'Angola.
Thank you. I'm a counselor at the Embassy of Angola. I have a question. During the discussion, I heard no reference made to GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and I think this is something that needs to be looked at in greater depth, because even within the European Union, there's still quite a debate on this issue. And recently, we've seen that seeds and products, GMO seeds and products, are increasingly arriving in Africa. And we're wondering whether there are risks to health, environment, and to public health in general. And we'd like to know more about this. Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Let's try to give the floor 1.5 minutes to each, starting with, we do the inverse. So Morag, you start, and maybe react to the questions. Clearly on GM, I will ask Jackie, GM seeds and GMOs requires a fully fledged presentation. We will not discuss such a controversial topic in 5-10 minutes. But we will touch on GM. So even your interventions, you can touch on the questions. We didn't discuss blockchains. I mentioned blockchains and how blockchains are being used in the European Union. I think we are still early days, but whoever has expertise and experiences in whatever you are doing in your respective areas of what blockchains can do and what is the role of value chains in Europe in terms of standard setting, it would be good to touch on this, and also on policy making, how to enhance policy making within the CADEP context. Is CADEP giving a lot of priority or not to national food systems? So, Morag, the floor is yours.
1.5 minutes is a challenge for addressing all of these issues, but somebody asked for five key points to take away. I'd go back again to holistic partnerships, export to local, policy to practice, and the opportunities that we have with technology actually now to address some of the really key issues of food security, in particular looking at blockchain. A lot's happening now in sort of high-end private sector that will trickle down, but it's something that really it's important to explore and invest in as a movement in terms of food safety. So that's what I meant by holistic. I thought I sort of covered that in the presentation, but obviously I didn't sort of get it across strongly enough. A supply chain will collapse through its weakest point in terms of food safety. And so there is a tendency, as somebody else, one of the other questioners mentioned, to focus in silos. So we'll look at a particular aspect of food safety and think that we've got things covered. Actually, you need to look at the whole supply chain, and you need to address it in a holistic way to get it covered, which means that there's a duty on us to work collaboratively to make sure that we achieve that. Something that I should have mentioned in the Kenya context is that that message really got home when they had their pesticide residue issue. And so while there were problems at all levels, really, that needed to be addressed, what Kenya did was to put together a national public-private sector action plan, and they had stakeholders represented in the development of this action plan from all elements of the supply chain. And so they ensured that they addressed the policy aspects of this as well as the practitioner elements of it. And I think it was a very important lesson that Kenya demonstrated, that government needs to take a strong lead here. It can't just be something that's addressed by the private sector. It needs to be top down, and it needs to be very well coordinated. And so I think that there are some really strong lessons that can be learnt from countries such as Kenya that could be applied elsewhere. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Yes, thank you for the question on, well, first the Kenyan milk market, and then on how to support policy. So that problem you described of milk being discarded in the local market and then sold next door is actually a global problem too. What the example that Michael mentioned earlier on the milk in China, neglected because of contamination with melamine, that milk powder has actually then later been exported to East Africa, where researchers found that the problem had just been relocated. So this is not just a local problem, it's a global problem. However, we think it's mostly related to the capacity of the different parties involved. So one is the veterinary service, in the case of animal source foods, including milk. Veterinary inspectors, they have been trained to treat livestock diseases on farm, but they have not been trained on the zoonotic aspects of the food that is produced. So that is one thing. The second thing is there's a lack of diagnostics in the market. There's no quick tests that the inspector can actually use to test if milk is compliant with standards or not, if meat is contaminated, if milk is contaminated with aflatoxins, and so on. Then the third is the capacity of the consumer that I was also mentioning in the presentation. So if the capacity of these three parties in the market is built, there's some system of checks and balances and community police, and then, it's a process of self-regulation partly. Of course, there are other problems like corruption that are also persistent in the markets. Now, how to support policy? We as researchers, we do that mainly by providing evidence on the prevalence of foodborne diseases. We are trying to provide evidence on the burden of the different diseases as shown in the WHO report on foodborne disease burden. We are trying to develop tools to prioritize this set of foodborne diseases, because not every foodborne disease has a similar impact on human health. One cause a bout of diarrhea, others cause lifelong epilepsy. So there are different foodborne diseases, and we're trying to develop metrics to prioritize these. Then we're trying to test solutions in very large trials that are statistically sound, which is very difficult to implement in these informal market settings due to the different clustered and biases, etc. And then we are studying incentives. How can we incentivize adoption of technologies, taking up of trainings, so they can actually have an impact on human health. And that is basically also our major outcome that we're measuring when we work in food safety. It's human health. It's not only the dimensions of export trade, it's human health.
Thank you, Cristina. Listra.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just focus on two of the questions that were raised. One that asked what are we doing to motivate policymakers to consider food safety capacity more and build capacity to regulate. And then the other one that talks about providing 5 recommendations. On the first point, I think for the Global Food Safety Partnership, we have 3 pillars of our work. The first pillar focuses on assessments and analysis of capacity. The second one looks at how do we convene stakeholders to evaluate what needs to be done at the country level to improve food safety capacity. And then the third pillar really focuses on how do we implement, what training programs, for example, can we provide in order to build capacity. And in that light, the Global Food Safety Partnership has worked a lot in East Asia, in Southern Asia, particularly I want to mention in the context of what can be done to motivate policymakers. I think as we've worked even in India, where we have a very close partnership with the Food Safety and Standards Authority India, we've looked at their model of saying food safety has to be really looked at from farm to fork or farm to fork, and that they look at food safety providing very specific guidance to support food safety in schools, food safety at home, food safety in places of worship, food safety in hospitals. And that, once again, ensures that consumers are empowered with the right amount of information. And so I want to stress that it is really important, even in our dialogue where we convene various stakeholders, to consider what outcomes and how we shape better outcomes in food safety, that we look at and look at an entire value chain approach where we have various actors along that chain providing support, but with the ultimate goal of empowering consumers. The second point on what are the 3 or 5 recommendations, one of the things I want to mention in the context of Africa, we also agree that collaboration is important. It is for that reason that we've worked very closely, that is the GFSP with CADAP, to support the biennial review process. But even as we look forward in terms of implementing the recommendations of this report, we plan to work very closely with the AU. So in terms of recommendations for what policymakers should do, I want to go back to the 3 recommendations that have come out of our report. The first one is that governments, national governments, really need to prioritize the public health concerns that then would allow for greater emphasis to be placed on food safety. For that, there needs to be increased emphasis on the evidence base for what are some of the key determinants of food safety, and what are the levers that can be used to then provide greater impact on better outcomes for food safety at the national level. Also, again, that there needs to be risk-based approaches, that we need to build capacity for well-governed evidence and risk-based food safety systems. And that is that we focus less on the hazards, but that we look at what risks these hazards pose, and based on those risks, determine the interventions and the level of effort that needs to be placed on hazards. And then on market-led, that we harness the marketplace drivers of progress on food safety. Again, this particular recommendation recognizes the importance of empowering consumers, of also harnessing the fact that the private sector is making huge investments in supporting food safety at the national level, and the private sector here includes farmers themselves who are really part of that private sector. And then even as we go further along the chain to supermarkets, etc., the standards generally that are imposed along particular value chains are usually supported by key private sector players who ensure that their supply chains are safe. And so as the public sector, we would support as well the public sector working hand in hand with the private sector to ensure that better outcomes for food safety are achieved at the national level, and that indeed we have food safety for all by 2030.
Thank you, Listra. And Jackie on the GMO question from Angola.
Merci. Je vais profiter aussi de l'interprétation.
Well, thank you. I'll take advantage of the interpretation too. It's never easy to answer with regards to substances or products that are very controversial. And just to take on from what Listra just said, we increasingly have retailers or companies, major supermarket brands, that try to take advantage of the fact that consumers don't really understand certain issues and scientific issues. And of course, there is a lot of divergence amongst scientists. And no matter what the rules are in the union or elsewhere, you see that there are problems, and sometimes they're justified, and sometimes they try to live up to a consumer, and in a way that's not sometimes satisfactory for those of us who are scientists. Now, when it comes to GMOs, I don't know really. In the past, I know that in certain area of genetics, we created some monsters. I don't know, does that mean that we should just be careful with regards to sort of engineering in the genetic engineering? Now, when it comes to the policy makers, I know certain actions were carried out. I had the opportunity to work with BTSF Afrique, a company in Africa, and we did some great work with the African Union and regional economic communities, and we came up with a standard inspired by Codex. Of course, you need to be clean. You have to have the cold chains, drinking water, very basic things. And of course, basic infrastructure is very important in developing countries. I am a vet, and we need basic things to deal with more complicated aspects when necessary. Now, what we came up with was approved by the heads of state and government in 2011 in the African Union. So now the ball is in the court of the African policymakers. The document is there. It is nothing extraordinary, and we worked with companies on the basics, and it did really work well. We got very good reactions from the African control services. It was wonderful for them to have this basis and to share with us how they worked. So that was very good. So that is when you start to look at formal companies. What is really difficult is the informal sector. We don't know where things start or end, really, there. So if you look at the European Union, we've often worked with informal companies. For example, some terrible abattoirs and slaughterhouses. So this is why it's very important to take account of CADEP. Whenever we have training, we try to say that colleagues from the sanitary control services, health control services, should take account of CADEP at the regional, national level, continental level. And it's important. And they could not necessarily see that because everyone was in their own silo, if you like. Everyone was working in their ivory tower. But this is not how it works here. We started with DG Agri, and we started at a smaller level. I don't think the SPS can work without this, because there's a market organization behind this. So all of this must be market-led. Obviously, when it is informal, you can, of course, bring the informal sector into the formal sector, but we need to connect the informal and what is being done by women. Formalization shouldn't exclude women. It shouldn't prevent the emancipation of women that can come through the informal sector. So things such as this. Thank you.
Jackie. Isolina, is the next briefing on blockchains and food systems?
We have it actually, yes, the blockchain, I saw that, well, the ICT tools, and one is blockchain, is certainly in the list. And we had two speakers actually, you know, foreseen from the private sector, well, including Cargill and Mars, who couldn't make it, but also African private sector for visa purposes cannot be here, from Kenya actually, that had a part already on that, because as you know, it's mostly very big companies, but we have examples in Africa. And knowing it's very much consumers driven, as Michael Scannell was saying before, so you can, through, know by scan or QR code, the whole history of the product, from the farm to the fork. So of course, is a transparent, is a way to eliminate fraud. It has different components. So I think it's too short here, to go into deep, and it deserves indeed another briefing. Thank you.
Thank you.